Welcome back. This is part 2 of the t-shirt quilt tutorial. As you can see, I've got all of my squares finely cut, and I ended up with 30 squares. And the next step that I would suggest is that you go ahead and lay them out on the floor how you want to arrange them. I try to put kind of scatter all the greens, all the blacks, just so we don't have the same shirt side by side. So I have done a 5 by 6 quilt. So there's 5 squares across and 6 squares down. So it's a total of 30 squares total. And remember, each block is 12.5 inches. So it'll be a really nice size quilt. Now, remember those smaller pieces that I was showing you earlier where we cut around the collar? Let me show you those. Here's one right here. And as you can see, I just laid it on another 12.5 inch piece of material. And you can use any color you want. I just happen to have some blue fabric that was left over from another quilt. So I just cut two 12.5 inch squares out of that fabric and just laid the square on top. Now, as of right now, we don't have any interfusing or interfacing, I should say, underneath the quilt. So if we were going to take this square and go sew it on the machine, you can see how thin and flimsy it is. It's going to get caught up in the machine pretty well. So for every square that you have cut, we have to iron on a fusing to the back of the square. So I'm going to show you what that looks like over at my quilting station here. So the interfusing, there's 2 different kinds of fusing that you can purchase. There's something called Wonder Under, and then another one called Pellon. I've used both. They come in varying weights. I prefer the Pellon. It's a little cheaper. It's softer. You can see it's got kind of a texture on one side of it, and the other side is smooth. But the idea is you want to cut. Since I have 30 quilt squares, I'm going to want to go ahead and cut 30 squares that are 12.5 inches in diameter, because I'm going to iron it onto the back of the 12.5 inch square. So to do that, you simply just kind of lay this out. Now, if you get the Pellon like what I'm using, it does come with a long strip of paper that gives you directions on how to use it. This is a featherweight is what I'm using for my squares. You can get a sturdier weight as well, but the featherweight works well for t-shirts. You don't want it so thick where, it feels like super heavy and bulky. We're not going for that. So you just kind of, once you get it, you buy it by the yard. And I think it's like $1.80 or something a yard. It's not very expensive, but you go through a lot of it. I'm just going to do the same thing I did with the t-shirt squares that we cut. I'm going to use the same 12.5 inch block, and I'll just line up the block to the fusing and use my rotary to cut out 30 12.5 inch blocks for the quilt. And you can see I've already got several of them already cut. I just need to go ahead and finish those out. So you'll need 30 of those. Now, once you get those all cut and ready to go, you'll also want to start thinking about your sashing. And the sashing is what goes in between your rows. So if I come back over here to the quilt, you'll see I left a space in between each of the quilt squares. So what we'll do is we're going to cut some sashing that we're going to sew on each side of the quilt block. And we'll do that when we piece it together, and I'll show you that in the next video series. But while you're cutting your featherweight fusing that's going to go on the back, you can also go ahead and cut out your sashing. That's what they call it. I like a really nice clean look on my t-shirt quilts. I like everything kind of lined up. Some people, you might have seen them, if you do a Google search, you'll find some t-shirt quilts that are all the designs are kind of piled on top of each other, but I really like the cleanliness of the lines. So all of my t-shirt quilts have sashing in between each of the rows and also in between each of the columns. So to cut the sashing, come back over here to my quilting corner. I'm going to use some scrap fabric. I'm going to save money as much as I can on this one. I have so much fabric it gets kind of left over. Let me cut this because it's getting caught what I'm doing. So I buy a lot of fabric at Hobby Lobby. I also buy a lot at Walmart. Kind of just depends on what I'm looking for. If you just want a cotton blend, Walmart's just fine. I've also used sheets before too, to use for sashing. You don't need a super wide fabric. This one is 48 inches wide. You can buy it in 44, 48, 54, 60. You can even get it all the way up to 108 inches if you need to. And that's for your quilts for the backing. So you want to cut along the fold. So just kind of folding this out. And I got this fabric on clearance. It was $2 for 2 yards, which is a pretty good deal. And this is what I'm going to use to cut all of my pieces. So for the sashing, you'll want a 12.5 length, but that really doesn't matter right now. What you'll want to worry about is the width of your sashing and how wide of a border that you want in between each of them. And I've decided, I think I'm going to do a 3-inch sashing in between, which is pretty wide. Most of the time I use a 2-inch sashing, but for this particular quilt, because it's a gift and I want to make it as large as I can, I'm going to go ahead and make it 3 inches. So from there, you want to go ahead and get your long cutting board. And I'm going to go ahead and get that, and you'll line it up to the 3-inch mark. Kind of line your fabric up. Now this isn't cut straight. When I got it, you can see it's got different seams here. So we will make it straight on one end. Let me line this up towards the bottom. And we'll just lay my board down. And we'll cut it like right at the 2-inch all the way up to make sure that it is nice and straight. And then once you cut that, you want to measure 3 inches over and cut your width all the way up. Every 3 inches, go ahead and cut your strips all the way along your fabric, every 3 inches. And then you can cut them to length, and we need 12.5 inch. So I'm going to see if I can set this down and do that real quick. So my first YouTube video series, and I need to get better equipment here so I can be a real production studio. All right, let me get my board. I'm going to go ahead and use both my hands now. I'm not holding the phone. I think on some of the professional YouTube videos, they probably have several assistants that help them. And I do not have an assistant to help me, only a 4-year-old. And that does not work out very well. So let me grab my board. And this board is longer than the square, so you can go all the way up the side. You can see that it's a pretty long board. Let's see, this is a 24-inch length. So I'm going to move my square out of the way. And I'm just going to straighten this up. And whenever you buy fabric, whoever you buy it from, most of the time, it's never cut straight. So you have to always cut the end off. Make sure it's straight. Now I have a nice straight edge, so I'm going to cut 3 inches. In fact, I think I need to do a little more. It's not straight yet. So we'll go another inch. One more time. So again, this is the sashing. We're going to cut this, get all of our cutting done before we start ironing on that fusing. All right, so I'm measuring over 3 inches because that's the width of the sashing that I'm going to go with for this particular quilt. And again, 2 to 2.5 is okay. I'm just going extra wide for this one. So I'm cutting a 3-inch strip. Like so. And I'm just going to set it aside, and I'll go ahead and cut one more of those. Just so I can demonstrate. Okay, another 3-inch strip. Go ahead and cut that up. All right, so then to cut it to length, I'm going to show you how to do that. My assistant has arrived. If you hear a little car noise, that would be Logan. So I'm going to lay it down now lengthwise, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this raw edge off. Now line that up and make sure I don't have any fraying edges on the end of that. That's good. And then 12.5 inches is what I'll need. So I'm going to go ahead and count over. And there's an old rule in quilting called measure twice, cut once. I completely live by that motto. So we've got 12.5 inch length sashing. I'm going to go ahead and cut that at 12.5 inches. So now I've got several pieces of my 12.5 sashing, and maybe my assistant Logan, could you get me a quilt block please on the floor? I don't know where it is. Right over there. Okay. I'll get my assistant here, and then I will show you how these will line up next to a quilt block. So you can see the 12.5 inch strip. Okay. I'm going to get 2 of them because you'll need 1 for each side. Okay.
This?
I'll get it. Thank you, assistant.
I want to get this one. I want the fire truck one.
Okay. So, got my quilt block here.
Alexa.
And you can see how the sashing, let me move this so you can see it. The sashing is going to go on each side. So once we get the fusing on the back of this, then we'll start sewing our rows together, and we'll sew the sashing here to the square, and then this sashing to the square, and then we'll go to the next one in the row, and we'll keep going. So I'm going to finish cutting all of the sashing up, making sure that all of my interfusing squares are cut. I need 30 of those, and then I'll need all of the sashing cut. Then in the next video tutorial, I'll show you how to iron on the fusing onto your square, and then we get to start assembling and putting it together. And by then, that's the exciting point, because you get to see it come together. So this is a quilting tutorial, how to make a t-shirt quilt by ACAT Designs. And this is the second tutorial. The first tutorial, I showed you how to cut the t-shirt quilts, the t-shirts. And now in this video, I shared how to cut the sashing and the interfusing that you're going to need when we get ready to sew it together. So we'll see you in the next video where we'll get to iron and start to sew.